Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, Katan, we're going to get right into the Ukraine-Russia situation, that war full force going on. Now, before the fighting broke out in Ukraine, most countries' diplomatic staff fled the capital of Kyiv. However, the Vatican's apostolic nuncio chose to remain despite the fact that his shelter could be a target at any time. Now, Bishop Vilvastes Kubalkas told Rome Reports in an interview his reasons for staying. He said, "I am not only an ambassador, I am also a nuncio. I have a double mission, the government and the church. I am a priest," he said, "and a bishop. I represent the Pope and the people. Here I move around with a backpack with essentials because it is difficult to know where I will have to go."
Well, due to the air raids lifting a bit, the bishop says he can give interviews and is now able to sleep. He has received overwhelming support from followers, which inspires him to continue in his work there. And he even jokes that it feels like Kyiv is the capital of the world right now.
Through the war, he is seeing the humanity in people coming forth, and he believes the Vatican can play a key role in mediating the conflict because the bishop says, quote, "The church is not neutral. The church is with everyone. The Catholic Church is in Ukraine and in Russia, for example, and what the church does not accuse. It distinguishes between evil and the person who commits it, because bad actions and people, because the mission of the church is to help people."
Well, and in line with the bishop's statement, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's #2 leader, has offered for the Holy See to act as a mediator to bring an end to the war. This was initiated by Ukraine's request on several occasions. Well, Ukraine's government and the Vatican are truly on friendly terms.
Well, in February of 2020, the Pope met with Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Now, this was their first and only meeting. Now, the Ukrainian president asked the Pope at that time for help liberating Ukrainian prisoners from Russia. On February 26th of this year, just a few days after the war in Ukraine began, the two leaders spoke over the phone. Now, the Pope expressed how sorrowful he was over the war taking place there.
During the phone call, news of an air bombardment taking place in Kyiv Street was reported. The Pope spoke out against the war using both Ukrainian and Russian on his Twitter account. He also encouraged Catholics to, quote, "pray together for Ukraine," end quote. After their phone call, President Zelensky, tweeted to his followers and the Pope, quote, "Thank Pope Francis for praying for peace in Ukraine and a ceasefire. The Ukrainian people feel the spiritual support of His Holiness," end quote.
Well, in a recent meeting with government officials, Russian President Vladimir Putin referred to the West as the Empire of Lies. And if you're not familiar with Russian, then please read the subtitles closely. Take a look at this video.
Я пригласил вас для того, чтобы поговорить о вопросах, связанных с экономикой, с финансами. Мы с Михаилом Владимировичем обсуждали эту тему, имея в виду, конечно, и те санкции, которые сейчас так называемое западное сообщество, как я его назвал в своем выступлении, это империя лжи, пытается реализовать в отношении нашей страны. Ну, давайте начнем. Пожалуйста, Михаил Владимирович.
Definitely some powerful and strong words from the Russian president. Well, in this next video, Press Secretary Jen Psaki tries to assure everyone that sanctions on Russia will not affect the global market. Also, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and the head of NATO, Hans Stoltenberg, speak out against Russian attacks on Ukraine and how NATO will handle things. Please also take a look at this video.
There isn't a strategic interest in reducing global oil supply because that will increase the price of barrels of oil and increase gas prices. So we are looking at ways to, and I said yesterday, I believe, that we are looking at ways to reduce the import of Russian oil while also making sure that we are maintaining the global supply needs out there. That we are looking at ways to reduce the import of Russian oil while also making sure that we are maintaining the global supply needs out there. That we are looking at ways to reduce the import of Russian oil while also making sure that we are maintaining the global supply needs out there. That we are looking at ways to reduce the import of Russian oil while also making sure that we are maintaining the global supply needs out there. I don't have anything to predict in terms of what that will look like, and we of course remain engaged with our friends in Congress.
We condemn the attacks on civilians, and over the night we have also seen reports about the attack against the nuclear power plant. This just demonstrates the recklessness of this war and the importance of ending it, and the importance of Russia withdrawing all its troops and engaging good faith in diplomatic efforts. NATO allies have implemented unprecedented sanctions.
And as the Secretary General said, ours is a defensive alliance. We seek no conflict. But if conflict comes to us, we're ready for it. And we will defend every inch of NATO territory. At the same time, as the Secretary General said, we're preparing for NATO's future. We're preparing for NATO's future. We're preparing for NATO's future.
Katan, just going back to what the spokesperson said for the White House there, I'm sure everyone is hoping that it doesn't affect the global market, but only time will tell, but we're probably going to see the prices over here even increase despite the war being over there in Ukraine.
Most certainly.
Well, NATO says it is not seeking to be involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine, but they will not shy away from it either. But the question on everyone's mind is, will the European and Western allies get involved, and what consequences could come from that? Now, just barely halfway into the second week of fighting in Ukraine and Russia bombed Europe's large nuclear power plant located in the Ukrainian country. Now, the bombing caused the fire to break out, causing global concerns of a radiation leak.
NATO officials were called to a meeting in Brussels due to the power plant attack. The alliance decided to impose more sanctions on Vladimir Putin himself, as well as his inner circle, while the United States is focusing on sanctioning business leaders with close ties to the Kremlin. Still, President Putin is unwavering in his mission and not willing to call off Russian soldiers. As you saw in the last video, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says NATO does not want a confrontation with Russia, but are prepared if a conflict comes, and the head of NATO called the war in Ukraine reckless.
Well, Mr. Blinken also assured the press every ally, in one way or another, is coming to Ukraine's assistance. Every ally, in one way or another, is helping to strengthen NATO itself. And as the Secretary General said, ours is a defensive alliance. We seek no conflict, but if conflict comes to us, we are ready for it, and we will defend every inch of NATO territory, he said. And remember, part of the concern that President Vladimir Putin had was that Ukraine would join in to NATO and be that much closer to their borders.
That's right. But why is Ukraine so important to Moscow, you might ask? Well, why is Putin so set on this invasion? Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire before becoming a Soviet republic. Now, in 1991, it won its independence from Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia's government's biggest concern is to keep Ukraine from joining the NATO alliance, like you just mentioned there, because he says it would go against NATO's promise not to expand eastward. However, since 1997, 14 countries, mainly in the east, have joined NATO's ranks. So Russia just continues to see that expansion of NATO closer and closer to its borders.
Right. Well, in 2014, mass protests broke out in the country, which led to the overthrow of President Viktor Yanukovych. Now, he supported closer ties with Moscow rather than the European Union. Now, Russia's response at that time was to annex the Crimea Peninsula and supporting a separatist uprising in eastern Ukraine, which has continued to this current time.
Well, now we're going to turn it over to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has some information for us regarding sanctions, and the fallouts with that. And, of course, NATO, as we mentioned before, they're speaking out quite a bit regarding Russia and condemning Russia's invasion, and a little bit from Ukrainian's President Zelensky on these attacks. Larry, what do you have for us?
There are several different fronts where warfare is concerned, and economic pressure is one of them. Preventing nations from buying and selling is a tactic employed by the West to bend incompliant nations to their will, and at present, Russia is one of those nations. Leaders like President Macron of France say Moscow must accept responsibility for the outcome of things due to their decision to invade Ukraine. But he believes that the sanctions imposed against the country by the U.S. and its cronies will produce consequences that extend beyond Russia and endanger the economic standing of nations throughout Europe, including his own. Mr. Macron believes that the effect of the West's financial war against Moscow and his nation's inability to continue conducting business with them due to it will diminish his country's purchasing power and ultimately impact, among other things, the nation's ability to buy food. Despite that, President Macron expressed a willingness to offer assistance to the growing stream of refugees flowing out of the Ukraine, as leaders across Europe are calling for a ceasefire that humanitarian aid might be distributed to those in need. Russia is also striking back with economic maneuvers itself, restricting flights just as others are impeding their flights, with the result that the airline industries are some of the first now who are admitting to feeling the pinch. In a televised conference, President Putin stated that Russia is only resorting to retaliatory measures where unfriendly behavior has been demonstrated towards them, and politically, he is urging a de-escalation in tensions and a normalization of relations among the parties at conflict. Jens Stoltenberg of NATO took to the stage accompanied by the U.S. to condemn the Russian attacks, including one of the latest on a power plant in southern Ukraine. There were concerns that the incident might cause damage to one or more of the plant's reactors and in so doing create a replay of Chernobyl, but reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency are that there was no damage to any reactors and no radiation leaks detected. In the midst of it all, the Ukraine's embattled president, Vladimir Zelensky, has sought to spur Europe on towards an allied front against Russia's actions, in one instance referring to Moscow's success in overtaking his country as the death of Europe. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, President Zelensky continuing to condemn the Russian attacks, but also starting to gain a lot of support from the Ukrainian people. They're backing him up. So, it seems like he's trying to drum up a lot of help to fight the Russians there in this invasion. That's right. Well, the fire at the nuclear power plant there in Ukraine that was struck by Russia in Ukraine had been contained, and the reports are coming out that there's no change in radiation levels as a result of those strikes. Remember, the fire had broke out earlier, but they got that under control. Now, the international community is pleading with Russia to cease its bombardment of the plant for fears of more fires reaching, or that the fire could possibly reach, those nuclear reactors. U.S. energy officials have said that the reactors they begin to safely shut down and are protected at this time by robust containment structures. So they're saying even though it's okay right now, if there continues, they're kind of worried about it.
Right. Now, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, saying that the reckless actions of President Putin could directly affect the safety of Europe. Ukrainian officials said the Russian troops are trying to seize the power plant, showing up to the area in tanks to assist in their efforts in doing so. Well, this plant accounts for a quarter of Ukraine's power, and Russia has already captured the defunct Chernobyl power plant to the north.
Russians are also feeling the sting of this war. Many of the soldiers involved aren't making it back home alive. Loved ones hope that those who go out will come back alive, but the hopes of those family members are shattered as they're left with the task of burying their dead. But Putin is determined to keep the status quo in this conflict, stressing a war against a neo-Nazi regime, despite the fact that the Ukrainian president is actually Jewish.
And I would think that that's causing a little bit of internal, I should say, resistance from Russia, seeing as though a lot of people are having to do this very thing and burying their own people, Russian people, because they're coming back from the war either maimed or not alive. Well, Putin said in a phone call with the Russian Security Council, quote, "I will never go back on the statement that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, even though a lot of Ukrainians have been threatened and brainwashed. We are fighting with the neo-Nazis, and they are using civilians as human shields," end quote. Putin said that unless Ukraine was diplomatically disarmed, he would continue his campaign.
Well, French President Emmanuel Macron told Putin that his thoughts about Ukraine being a neo-Nazi regime was deluded, and Putin would end up doing his country much harm if he continued on this course. Now, Russia has defended itself in regards to this conflict, even preventing the Russian media from referring to it as a war. Now, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the U.S. is trying to impose its understanding of how to live in Europe. Now, this begs comparisons. Now, at the time, Napoleon and Hitler had an objective to bring the whole of Europe under their control. Now, Americans have the whole of Europe under their control.
Well, take a look at this next video of the Ukrainian president's talks about his pleading with the world leaders for help with the conflict in his country, and, of course, with the international community and the Russian president himself thinks of the current situation.
Я звернувся про закриття неба, я звернувся до президента Байдена, я звертався до, мені здається, і до Шольца, Макрона. Чому я кажу «здається»? Тому що я по 20-30 дзвінків, міжнародних дзвінків я проводжу щоденно.
C'est donc bien seul et de manière délibérée que, reniant un à un les engagements pris devant la communauté des nations, le président Poutine a choisi la guerre. Il n'y a pas de troupes ni de bases de l'OTAN en Ukraine. Ce sont des mensonges. La Russie n'est pas agressée, elle est l'agresseur.
Уважаемые товарищи, хочу сказать, что специальная военная операция идет в строгом соответствии с графиком, по плану. Все поставленные задачи успешно решаются.
Katan, it's going to be interesting to see what NATO does, because they said they will not get involved in this war, but yet it seems as if they want to lend some support there to Ukraine, and President Zelensky is really asking for their support. So it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, NATO decides to do.
And if something does occur with a NATO country who decides to lend a hand to Ukraine and they end up getting attacked by Russia, well, then's that invoking of that Article 5, and everyone comes to the aid of that NATO country, and then we have an international war between NATO and Russia. Quickly it can escalate.
Well, lastly, that nuclear power plant that we were speaking about earlier in the broadcast, Russian troops have taken control of it. Now, President Biden imposed more sanctions on Russian oligarchs, which are the very rich business leaders and a person that has a lot of political influence. Right. Many of those leaders are encouraged the U.S. president, and many, not the oligarchs, but many other leaders have encouraged the U.S. president to go further with the pressure on Russia. Remember, they put a lot of sanctions on there, and those oligarchs received some of that pressure, a lot of it, hoping that they would go back to President Putin saying, you need to ease up in the war or pull out because this is hurting us.
Yeah, they don't like that money being hurt.
That's right.
Some of those sanctions are put directly on those people, not just Russia itself. Like you said, there are some of those suggestions coming from within the United States or several of the other supporting allies are the banning of U.S. imports of Russian oil. Now, the Biden administration warns that gas prices will spike even higher, especially if they go with this move, further padding Putin's pockets. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had some harsh words to say regarding how to deal with the Russian president in the message to the Russian people, saying, quote, "You need to take this guy out by any means possible," end quote. Well, those statements criticized by the Russian ambassador, saying that those words are a call to terrorism.
And when the leaders start throwing around things like that, you know, people, that's pretty harsh, and you know, they take that seriously. And you have a leader that's supposed to be in a position where he can govern himself, not according to emotions, but, you know, making the sensible decisions, and he's saying, hey, take this guy out. It's not really the way that the leader should be handling it.
That's right.
Well, Ukraine's Zelensky says that he wants to speak directly to Putin, while Putin says that the Russian operation is going as planned as Russia captures its first major city. Now, Blinken stated while meeting with the counterparts at NATO headquarters in Belgium, he said while attacks are increasing, it is suspected that nearly 4 million Ukrainians will flee their country. And of course, that's going to put a lot of extra burden on the countries around Ukraine there to take in all those that are fleeing Ukraine.
Yeah, because most of those countries are also NATO countries, like we mentioned earlier. Well, world leaders are working to open up humanitarian corridors for people to flee to safety, with Russian convoys roughly 15 miles outside the Ukrainian capital. There's warning that the worst is yet to come. And I think that what's on a lot of people's mind, and the big concern, and like we mentioned in the previous news broadcast, that Putin is not afraid to go nuclear if need be, so that they don't have to bend to the demands of NATO, Catholic Church, and of course the United States.
Right, and that's what that was one of the things that Putin said, that, you know, we want to remind the world that we are a strong superpower. So he wanted to let NATO know and the rest of the world that we're not just going to be, you know, we're not just going to be a pushover in this thing. And if NATO joins in, said, look, I'm just reminding you all, we have a great nuclear arsenal.
That's right, and we can't forget that Russia is still one of the members of the quartet that Yisrael Hawkins did speak on many times, that was actually a part of holding back these wars. What do we do now when they're actually bringing them forth? We're going to see it unfold here very quickly. Well, if you'd like to learn more about the current prophecy and that we're living in, and of course what is yet to come according to the scriptures, write the House of Yahweh. And when you do write, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and the monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them at any of their websites by going to yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website for more news by going to YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@yahweh.com. For any international calls, there's a number on your screen now that you can call. And once again, don't forget to check out the Yisrael Says program by going to YisraelSays.com and the Ask Yisrael program by going to AskYisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Make sure you have some pencil and the paper. And of course, it'd be helpful to have your scriptures with you as well, because up next is a very informative message from Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.